All right, good evening, everyone. It's 7 p.m. on the dot, and welcome to tonight's presentation, An Introduction to Grants. My name is Nathan Zabidio, and I am an Associate Director of Program Operations here at Fractured Atlas. I hope everyone can hear me okay. If at any time there's an audio issue, please use the webinar chat functionality to message me, and I'll do my best to troubleshoot the problem. In fact, if someone wouldn't mind using the Zoom webinar chat to just confirm that you can hear the sound of my voice, that would be greatly assuring to me. Someone could just send me a message that they can hear me. Thank you so much. One time I started giving a webinar and got about 10 minutes through my spiel before someone chimed into the chat, "Is this thing still happening?" So it's always nice to know that I'm not just speaking into the void. Tonight's webinar is being recorded, so don't feel pressured to jot down copious amounts of notes. I will send you a link to the recording later this week, which you're welcome to share with anyone that you think might be interested. There'll also be an opportunity at the end of the presentation for questions, but feel free to chat me questions throughout. If it's relevant, I'll answer as I go, otherwise I'll save it for the end. Before we get much further, I'd like to say that it's nice to meet you all, even in this digital setting. This is obviously a picture of my face. A little bit about myself. I've been with Fractured Atlas for almost 7 years now. Prior to that, I was a card-carrying member myself, using our programs and services to fundraise for some independent off Broadway theater productions that I produced right out of college. And I work with a team of 12 artists and arts administrators who service almost 75,000 members internationally. That number includes around 4,200 fiscally sponsored artists, arts projects, or arts organizations. Since 2002, we've helped artists raise over $154 million, a little more than 23 million of which was in the last 12 months alone. All right, let's dive in. In tonight's webinar, we're going to answer the following questions. First, what is a grant? It helps to start with the basics. This is an introductory webinar after all. And before you start looking for grants, it's important to know the role that grant making plays in the nonprofit sector at large. Next, we'll discuss, am I ready to apply for grants? There are I's to dot and T's to cross before you're a truly competitive grant seeker. So we'll talk about grant readiness. After that, we'll discuss, how do I find grants that are right for me? So doing research on prospective funders. What do I need to prepare when I'm working on a grant application? And how do I work with Fractured Atlas when submitting a grant proposal? As you probably already know, with fiscal sponsorship, Fractured Atlas extends some of the benefits of our 501c3 status to artists, arts projects, and arts organizations in order to open the doors to funding opportunities that they are not otherwise eligible for on their own. Most arts funding in the United States comes from individual donors, and our fiscal sponsorship program does enable you to solicit tax-deductible donations from individuals, but it can also make you eligible for certain grant opportunities. In this breakdown, you'll see that 59% of contributed revenue for our fiscally sponsored projects comes from individual donors. And these numbers largely map to other arts nonprofits across the United States. So whether you're in New York City as an opera company or in Boise, Idaho as a art studio, a nonprofit art studio, you'd likely see your contributed revenue map to these numbers. In today's webinar, we'll be talking about how to access the remaining 41% of contributed revenue, which comes in the form of funding from institutions, otherwise known as grants. So to begin, what is a grant? Charitably inclined individuals and families, as well as corporations, often want to give back to their communities or financially support causes that are dear to them. To do so, they sometimes form a foundation, a separate legal entity from themselves, and endow it with their funds to be donated in the form of a grant. These grants then go to support projects or organizations that align with the interests of the funders. And because there are tax incentives for the individuals and corporations involved, when they want to form foundations, the IRS oversees their giving activities. Grants from a foundation must be made for charitable purposes within specific guidelines, which are often outlined in the foundation's charter that is filed with the IRS. Grants can also be awarded by local, state, or federal government entities. Some grants can be made to individuals, but most are only available to organizations who've received 501c3 status from the IRS. So that's where fiscal sponsorship can help open the door. Foundations can award their grants in two different ways. Foundations sometimes award grants as the result of a competitive application process where they accept open submissions and decide how to allocate funding among the best applicants. They can also award grants on a discretionary basis, meaning that they likely do not accept unsolicited submissions. So likely there's not an open call for applicants. But instead, individuals, projects, and/or organizations are selected and funded at the behest of the foundation's decision makers, usually their board of directors or trustees. And making the distinction between competitive and discretionary funding will be important later on when we're researching potential grant makers who might be a good fit for our projects. So grant funding is limited and extremely competitive. The lion's share of contributed revenue for arts organizations in the United States comes from, as we saw, individual donors. So we strongly encourage artists to prioritize individual giving when creating a fundraising plan for their project or company. Before you spend your time writing grant proposals, you need to determine your level of grant readiness. Grant readiness describes how prepared you are to pitch yourself, your project, or your company as competent and successful enough to warrant consideration by a foundation. There certainly are grants out there for seed money and emergency grants for artists and arts organizations who are in a pinch. But the vast majority of opportunities are for grant seekers who are already on their feet, have a proven track record of success, are fiscally solvent, and are already making an impact in their field or discipline. When our fiscally sponsored projects want to apply for grants, we require that they clear a quick eligibility hurdle, where we ask that they have raised at least $1,000 from other sources first. This eligibility requirement is based on feedback from grant makers who are largely uninterested in awarding grants to artists and arts organizations who do not have existing revenue streams or committed support from their community and other stakeholders. Beyond that, we also advise that you have a body of work under your belt before you consider applying to foundations for grants. Likely, they'll want to see a track record of at least 2 years' success before they will find you a competitive candidate for funding. When a funder is evaluating whether or not they want to award you a grant, they want to ensure that their funds are being used as effectively and efficiently as possible. And they're unlikely to fund projects where their grant represents a significant portion of the total project budget. It's also important to note that grant funding often has a longer fuse than individual giving. When you submit a grant proposal, you might not hear back with the foundation's decision for several months, and even then it might be longer still for them to cut you a check. So all of this is just a long way of saying and unpacking that you must not look to grants as your primary source of contributed income to meet immediately pressing needs. So let's revisit this breakdown of contributed revenue for our sponsored projects. You should expect around or at least 59% of your contributed income to come from individual donors. And this is what you should use to meet your pressing needs. The primary goal of institutional funders is not to fill in your budget shortfalls. Rather, they want to award grants that will amplify and improve the awesome work that you're already doing. And to help illustrate these points, let's talk through a checklist that you might want to go through to evaluate your own grant readiness. Again, this is about being able to sell yourself as competent and successful so that a funder trusts you to put their grant to its best use. So first, on a basic level, have you met our grant eligibility requirement? Have I raised at least $1,000 within the last 2 years for the work that I'm seeking funding for? What's more, do I have diverse revenue streams? So donations, in-kind support, so non-cash donations, ticket sales, merchandise sales, etc., and a plan for maintaining these over the long haul. And even further, do I have a detailed budget for my project or company that outlines both my planned income and expenditures? Many projects or companies, especially those that are new or small, have an off-the-cuff approach to their finances and don't have long-term or even mid-term projections for where they're heading and how they plan to get there. This was certainly the boat I was in when I first started out producing my own theater projects. So if this describes you, then you're probably not yet ready to apply for grants, as a budget is very likely to be a piece of documentation that they'll require at some point in the process. So to move on to the success portion of our checklist, have I been in operation for at least 2 years? Can I point to a body of work that demonstrates my track record? And do I have evidence that documents my previous work? For example, photos from your past productions, an active website, an engaging social media presence, sample marketing materials, testimonials from people who've experienced your work. And even though we only require that you as a fiscally sponsored project raise at least $1,000 before you're technically eligible to apply for grants, we'd argue that there's a difference between eligibility and competitiveness. Only if you can answer yes to all 6 of the questions on this checklist should you consider yourself a truly competitive grant seeker. Once we've determined our readiness, we can look for appropriate grants for which we might be a good fit. So let's talk about a few ways that we do that. And we'll go through a few recommended resources that can help guide your research. Fortunately, Fractured Atlas can give you a leg up in identifying funders who might be appropriate for your project or company. We've developed a grant toolkit that we customize for our fiscally sponsored projects. All you need to do is email us to request a toolkit and quickly remind us of your artistic discipline, so theater, film, visual arts, dance, etc., and the geographic area in which you operate. Within 2 weeks, we'll be able to prepare a toolkit for you that includes a list of funders for you to research further. In addition to our grant toolkit, we regularly post upcoming grant deadlines to our blog, and this list goes out in our monthly fiscal sponsorship newsletter. The toolkit also contains some great educational resources for prospecting grant makers. The list of funders that we provide is by no means an exhaustive list, and you will need to do some detective work on your own to determine which prospects on the list are truly perfect fits for your project. So there's no substitute for you taking that list and then going off to do your own research. And let's quickly talk about how you would do that. One go-to resource that you should immediately investigate is your local arts council. Most cities or counties will have an arts council that might be a funding organization that you can apply to for grants, but will likely also be a wealth of knowledge for artists and arts organizations in your area. Your local arts council might have some good leads for other grant makers that you should check out. Beyond that, there are a couple of great online resources that we strongly recommend that you use. First, the Foundation Center. They are an online database of funders in all fields and disciplines internationally. You do have to pay a fee in order to access their listing from your own computer, but they also have in-person library locations where you can go to search the database for free. Their official locations are in just a few cities across the United States like New York, but they also partner with several, and by several I mean hundreds, of local libraries and community centers in what they call their funding information network. You can visit these partner organizations and also search the listing for free. Take a look at the Foundation Center website for more info. You should be able to see a map of all the locations nationally and even internationally that they partner with to be able to access their database. And they also provide great educational resources, both webinars and in-person training sessions. I've attended some myself and can attest to how valuable they are. Using the Foundation Center, you can do a customizable search of foundations using a lot of different criteria. For example, what geographic areas do they fund projects in? What artistic disciplines are they interested in? And do they accept unsolicited proposals? Most grant makers have profiles on the Foundation Center's website. Many profiles contain a wealth of information that you can use to determine if the funder is a good fit. And you can also usually find a list of staff or board members who work at or volunteer for the foundation to see if you know any of them personally or if you're a few degrees of separation away from them and can hopefully reach out to them through your mutual contacts. Another online resource that we recommend is Knifesource by the New York Foundation for the Arts. Here you'll find a listing of not only grants, but also job postings, fellowships, and other services for artists. And it's not just New York-based artists, which the name might lead you to believe. The opportunities posted here are nationwide and are free to access. So I can also speak to the value of Knifesource. A little more than 7 years ago, I saw a job listing posted there for a program associate position at Fractured Atlas. And here I am, literally almost 7 years later, my anniversary is later this month, as an associate director. So this is a truly valuable resource for artists across the country. Finally, I recommend looking at other artists and arts organizations in your community. Check out their websites, newsletters, playbills, etc., to see if they're getting any grants, and then add those to your list of funders to do some more research on. It's not a zero-sum game where you're taking money away from them. These funders are very likely interested in funding projects and artists and organizations like yours in your community. So by all means, do that level of detective work. If you're a theater company in Chicago, look at the other theater companies in your neck of the woods and see who else are they getting grants from, and start to look into those further. So once you've used some combination of our grant toolkit, our blog, local arts councils, the Foundation Center, Knifesource, and maybe even some light Googling, you'll probably have arrived at a fairly long list of potential funders to do further research on. Your work does not end here, though. I cannot emphasize enough, once you've arrived at a list of prospects, you shouldn't just then send them a blanket solicitation letter. Instead, you need to take this list and whittle it down to find the handful of funders for which you're a truly competitive fit. So what do you do next? First off, check out the funder's website. If there's a formal application process, you'll find guidelines there. According to the Foundation Center, however, around 90% of funders don't have their own websites. Somehow this is still true in the year 2018. So what do you do then? There's another great online resource, this one totally free, called Guidestar. All US foundations and nonprofit organizations, like Fractured Atlas, have profiles on Guidestar. And a foundation's profile will include their recent 990s, a 990 being the tax form that foundations and nonprofits need to file with the IRS each year. So let's talk about the 990. It's definitely not the most exciting document in the world, to be sure. But if you learn to read between the lines, you can find a lot of good information that can help you determine if a foundation is a good fit for you. When I open up a 990, I'm not reading through the whole thing, because that could be hundreds of pages long and is pretty Byzantine at certain parts around a foundation's finances. But here's what I am going to look at. One of the first things I do is scroll down to Part 15, and it's in Roman numerals, so it'll be Part XV, where you can learn more about how a grant maker accepts applications. This is especially useful if the foundation doesn't have a website with info about how to submit. Sometimes the 990 will include a description of the types of requests that they fund, what to send the funder, any supplemental documentation to provide with your submission, and also the contact info for the person to whom your request should be addressed. But most importantly, Part 15 asks a crucial question to which you should pay special attention. And this is the direct quote from Form 990. Check here if the foundation only makes contributions to pre-selected charitable organizations and does not accept unsolicited requests for funds. So remember all the way back to when I discussed competitive versus discretionary funding. Here's where, if the foundation has checked this box off, then you know that they only award grants in the form of discretionary funding. So they don't have an open application process where just anyone can send them a submission for consideration. It's that likely their board of directors or someone on their staff or their trustees have established relationships with artists and arts organizations or other types of nonprofits that they want to award funding to. So if you see this box checked off, then there are two things that you can do. Maybe you decide to cross this funder off your list of prospects as they don't have a competitive funding opportunity. Or you can see if there's a way to make it onto their list of pre-selected charitable organizations. On the 990, you'll be able to see who else has received an award from the funder that year. So pay careful attention to that, especially to the award amounts. When you look at who received funding from a given grantor, you can also see the size of the grant that they were awarded. And this will give you a sense of the range of award amounts that the funder offers, which can serve a couple of purposes. First off, it'll continue to help you evaluate your competitiveness for a given foundation. So if you see that they only offer grants of $100,000 or more, and your total budget is only $10,000, then you're probably not right for them until you become a much bigger enterprise. Also, it'll help you come up with an appropriate ask amount if you ultimately do decide to submit a proposal. So it would stand to reason that if a foundation only awards grants of $5,000 or less, you shouldn't ask for more than that when you send in your proposal. On the 990, you can also find out who works for the foundation and who's on their board of directors. Part 8 of the 990 will list the highest paid employees at the foundation, if applicable, if they have any paid staff, as well as the members of their board. If the funder states that they only support pre-selected organizations, you can and should take a look at this list of names. Share it with your inner circle if you have any advisors that you trust, and see if anyone that you know is friendly with a member of their board and can facilitate an introduction. You can see if there's any contact info whatsoever, like a phone number or email address, to try to connect with someone at the foundation to gather more details. A former director of development at Fractured Atlas, someone who has raised tens of millions of dollars for major cultural institutions in New York City, has said that she has only been successful at being awarded a grant when she's been able to make a personal contact with the funder before submitting a proposal. I think she's probably exaggerating slightly, but it's important to remember that successful fundraising of all stripes is about relationship building. So you're more likely to be awarded a grant if you've worked on cultivating a relationship with the funder before you even ask them for money. So to be able to just give a call to a program officer on their staff and say, hey, I'm interested in learning more about your priorities and what you really care about. And let me tell you a little bit about what I'm working on, and maybe you can let me know if this is a good fit between us. That way, if it's all systems go and you submit that proposal, there's someone that you've already hopefully made an ally with on their staff who will see it come in their email or see the manila envelope come in the mail, and they already know a little bit about what you're doing and hopefully like you enough that they might be able to grease the wheels or give your proposal special consideration. So if you've done your homework, you'll have completed your due diligence for being a responsible grant seeker. And remember, the goal of this research is to give you the info that you need to be able to make a good call for whether or not you're an appropriate fit for a funder's mission. So, what are the key pieces of information that you want to take away from your research of a given funder? I hope you will indulge me one more checklist. So, do they have open competitive application process? Do they have an open competitive application process, or do they only award discretionary funding? Do they fund projects or companies like mine in my geographic area? Self-explanatory. Do they have any upcoming deadlines? Because you'd want to pay special attention to those. What documentation do they need from me and or from my fiscal sponsor if necessary? For that matter, do they even fund fiscally sponsored projects? We operate under the assumption that unless they explicitly state otherwise, most funders would be willing to work with a fiscal sponsor, but some explicitly and expressly do not, most notably the National Endowment for the Arts. And is there someone at the foundation that I can contact to learn more about their funding priorities? Ultimately, all of this research is getting back to learning more about the funder's mission. And you should only apply to a given foundation if their goals, if their mission align with your project's or company's goals and mission. So some things that you don't want to do. Don't stretch your goals, don't stretch your mission or stretch your activities to match a funding opportunity. For example, if a grant maker funds teaching artist programs, it's not a great idea to just make up your own teaching artist program and add that to your activities just to be eligible to apply for that grant, especially if it's not relevant to the other work that you do. And by the same token, funders can tell when you're sending a blanket letter to lots of different grant makers. We strongly discourage you from doing this. Unlike individual giving, grant seeking is not a numbers game. It's not true that the more proposals you send out, the more grants you will be awarded. Foundations are in regular contact with each other at conferences and other networking events, and they usually talk about applicants who've submitted proposals to them. So it won't do you any favors to submit proposals to foundations that are not appropriate fits. If you're ultimately unable to glean any useful information from their website, their 990, or contact someone at the funder, then it's almost certainly not a good use of your time to submit a proposal to them. And you should, with no reservations, cross that foundation off your list. Hopefully, however, this research will have led you to the small handful of grant opportunities that are perfect for your work. So, once you've found some good prospects, it's time to start writing your submission. First, it's important to determine if you're preparing a letter of inquiry, or LOI, or a full proposal. The funder's website, their 990, or a conversation with someone on their staff should help you figure out what to work on. An LOI is a brief written request for funding consideration. Sometimes this is only the first part of the application process. Often it's just the first step, and there'll be a longer proposal that they'll ask you to submit after that. In the LOI, you're usually asking for an invitation to submit a full proposal that goes into more detail on your funding needs. To that extent, the LOI is a mini version of the longer proposal. Unless the funder explicitly states otherwise, your LOI should be about 2 to 3 pages in length. And here are the things that you'll need to consider putting into both the LOI in abbreviated form and a longer proposal. First, and at a most basic level, which often evades a lot of people's grasp, an executive level project summary that articulates your goals and what is being requested of the funder. Be sure to have a specific ask amount in mind for a given funder and be able to articulate it clearly in your submission. Keep in mind that your ask amount should represent a relatively small proportion of your total project or company budget. How much to request can vary depending on a specific funder's guidelines, but we generally recommend that you limit your ask amount to less than 25% of your project budget, and if possible, to less than 10% of your budget. You'll also want to include a need statement, which demonstrates that your project or company is playing a vital role in solving a problem or addressing an issue in your field of interest. You're offering the funder the chance to be a part of the novel solution that you're proposing with your work. A narrative that tells the story of who, what, where, when, how, and why. Here's where you would make the case that what you're doing is innovative and worthy of support. You'd also describe who you're serving and how you're going to accomplish your mission. Funders are also interested in an outline of the specific outcomes that you're trying to achieve. As a result of the work that you're doing, what do you hope will happen with your company, with your discipline, or with your community? And also, how do you plan to measure these outcomes? How will you know that they've been successful? So, as a executive level summary, I might say, we're producing after school theater classes and productions with high school students in my neighborhood. We're looking at a couple different high schools. As a need statement, I might say, arts funding in my city has been drastically reduced, and these schools lack any kind of arts curriculum whatsoever. So we're fulfilling a vital need in this community by exposing students to these type of activities in a way that they wouldn't otherwise have access to. And then as my outcomes, I might try to identify, well, what are we actually, what is the point of these arts classes? What is the point of these theater workshops that we're trying to produce? Is it to reduce bullying in these schools? Is it to improve SAT test scores? And can I measure those outcomes? Can I say, studies have shown that classes similar to this increase a student's test scores on average by 100 to 200 points. So in 6 months' time, when our juniors take their SATs, we're going to hopefully hear back from them with what their results were and see if that maps to what the national average is for these types of activities. And this is usually one of the more important parts that a funder might be interested in, is what are your outcomes and how are you measuring them? There's certainly intangible outcomes, certainly creating a sense of community in your neighborhood, exposing individuals to fantastic artistic productions that they might not otherwise know exist. And you'll definitely have some intangible outcomes, but I really challenge you to try and find what are the measurable outcomes that your activities create, and how can you show that you've hit your mark, hit your targets. In an LOI and a grant proposal, you'll also want to describe what are your qualifications. Why are you and your team the right people for the job? So just be able to have brief bios or CVs prepared for you and the important people on your team. And then you'll also want a budget. In an LOI, you might not be required to submit a separate budget document, but you should have one prepared regardless. Even in an LOI, you still want to indicate your total project or company budget and how much you raised for the work so far, so that the funder has an idea of how their grant would fit into your overall fundraising plan. So for my after-school theater workshops, I might say, the total cost will be $25,000 for this year, of which we've already raised $14,000 in a crowdfunding campaign, and we have other grant proposals into ABC funders for these amounts. We're therefore looking for you to supplement our income with a grant of $4,000. We fortunately have a separate webinar for budgets, which I encourage you to check out. There should be a recording of it in our online knowledge base. And in a grant application budget, you want to include a thorough list of not only your expenses, but also an outline of all your sources of revenue, both committed and pending. So these are just general guidelines for either an LOI or a full proposal. Obviously, defer to the foundation's guidelines whenever possible and follow them to the letter. Beyond that, make sure that the little details, formatting, spelling, etc., are spot on before submitting. For funders who either have an online application or have very specific guidelines, um, I would use these to as a hint for whether or not you're a good fit for that opportunity as well. So, if you do all your research, you're like, on paper, we should be perfect for this foundation. And then you look at their guidelines or the specific questions that they ask, and you find that you can't provide answers to them, then maybe you're not ready or they're not actually right. So for example, a question that comes up often with corporate funding opportunities is they might say, excuse me, uh, what what volunteer opportunities can you offer to our employees? Because that's an important thing that they want to be able to uh, take their employees out of the workplace and get them in the community. Probably wearing a T-shirt with their company name on it to show, oh, look at all the good work our company's doing. And if you can't offer a volunteer opportunity to their employees, then maybe you're actually not quite right for them. To go back to a previous slide, you wouldn't want to then invent a volunteer opportunity if that's not something that you're prepared to do. So put it in your back pocket, put it on the back burner, say maybe in the future once we've actually either grown a little bit or figured some things out. Other things that often come up, questions that might indicate that you're not quite right for a particular funder. An opportunity that's actually going to be opening up very soon is the MAP Fund, which MAP stands for Multi-Arts Performance. So it's for projects that have a live performance component. And they're interested in projects that sort of are at the vanguard of pioneering new arts forms or new techniques. So if you're producing just a standard performance of Hamlet that isn't in some way innovative, then probably that's not a good fit for you either, because they'll almost certainly ask, in what way is your work pushing the boundary? And if you can't provide a solid answer, maybe not the right fit for you in that way as well. Okay, fortunately, if you're fiscally sponsored by Fractured Atlas, you'll have access to a second set of experienced eyes reviewing your grant applications before they're submitted to provide feedback. So let's talk about what that review process is like. As with all fundraising materials, grant applications from our fiscally sponsored projects need to be reviewed and approved by a Fractured Atlas staff member before they're submitted to the funder. With certain applications, it's possible that Fractured Atlas will need to submit them on your behalf. For grant makers that accept online applications, we might even need to set up login credentials for you in order for you to be able to submit. In any case, you can email us about grant opportunities or proposals that you're working on at support@fracturedatlas.org, and we'll take a look to see what actually all needs to happen in order to get you set up. For grant applications, we ask for 10 business days to review and approve your materials. This allows us to take a deep dive on your proposal and also thoroughly research the funder. If applicable, we'll provide feedback that will hopefully help maximize the competitiveness of your submission. If you need to expedite review of a grant application, we often need to charge a $75 rush fee. As you research funders, we encourage you to keep a grants calendar where you mark grant deadlines and also write in the Fractured Atlas deadline for at least 10 business days prior to when the completed application is due. The rush fee will apply if you need a turnaround time of 5 business days or less. Most grant applications will require some kind of documentation from Fractured Atlas, like a letter confirming your fiscal sponsorship with us, or our IRS determination letter, which confirms our own 501c3 status. They might even ask for a copy of our 990 or audited financials, our board list. There's a whole host of documents that they might be interested in taking a look at. And the 10 business day window allows us the time to gather these materials. When we review your grant applications, we'll be looking to see that you've included the standard text for grants. This is a one-paragraph summary of what the fiscal sponsorship arrangement is and can be found in a few different places on our website. If you're already fiscally sponsored, when you log into our site, you have access to an online portal called your My Fiscal Sponsorship page. So you can find the standard text in our program guidelines on your My Fiscal Sponsorship page, and it's also in the knowledge base if you do a search for the standard text. If and when you're awarded a grant, it's likely that there will be a contract involved. Fractured Atlas might need to sign it on your behalf, or you might be able to sign it on your own, or some combination of the two. We might both need to sign it. So you should expect to work with us on the completion of the contract at some level. It's possible that you get the award letter from the funder and a copy of the contract. Congrats, you're being awarded a grant. Just email it to us. Scan and email it, fax it, give us a call, say, hey, what am I supposed to do with this? It's possible and likely that we've already worked with the funder before, so we can go back through our past submissions and see, oh yeah, for this foundation, you can sign it yourself and send it in. Or we might say, actually, our board president needs to sign it, so send it over to us ASAP so we can get that signature. One common contractual requirement is that many funders ask for reports on how their funds are being used. Sometimes it'll just be a single final report. Sometimes it'll be one or more progress reports. But when we see that in the contract, we'll set up automated reminders in our system that will ping you when the reports are due. And as with other grant materials, we ask that you send your grant reports to us for review before they're submitted to the funder. Okay, phew. We have reached the end of my prepared remarks. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen. I'm going to open up for questions shortly. But before I do, I want to quickly plug our other webinars. This is just one in a series. You can find upcoming presentations listed on our website and also recordings of past webinars in our online knowledge base. So you'll see there's a whole host of topics here. You can look at the online calendar to see what's coming up next. And hopefully there'll be something that you'll be interested in. All right, I don't appear to have, some questions are coming in. Can fiscally sponsored projects apply for grants that don't require fiscal sponsorship for eligibility without sending materials in to be reviewed by Fractured Atlas or without including the fiscal sponsorship text? The answer is yes. There certainly are those opportunities, I mentioned them at the beginning, that don't require 501c3 status, that award grants to individuals or non-exempt entities directly. In instances like that, you are welcome to apply to that funder all on your own. And it might be in your best interest to do so because we take a 7% administrative fee. So if you want to avoid that fee, then by all means, go ahead and submit on your own, accept the grant directly if you're awarded payment. One thing to keep in mind is that some funders give you the option of applying on your own or applying with a fiscal sponsor and having payment made through a fiscal sponsor. So I want to quickly talk about why you might choose one thing or the other. All grant income, whether it comes from a funder directly or whether it comes from via our fiscal sponsorship program through Fractured Atlas, is going to be taxable income to you as an individual or your business entity. So if you're awarded a grant from XYZ Foundation, they send you the check for $10,000, you'll need to report $10,000 of income on your taxes for that calendar year. The way our fiscal sponsorship program and fund disbursement works, however, you might want to split that up between different calendar years. So let's say you don't have $10,000 worth of expenses in a given calendar year. You might be on the hook for paying some taxes on that income because you can't say, hey, I have $10,000 worth of income from this funder. I have $10,000 worth of expenses that directly offset that income, and therefore I shouldn't be taxed on it. With our fiscal sponsorship program, we'd accept that $10,000, and then it would only be income to you if and when you disperse it from us. And we're happy to hold on to it for as long as you need us to until you have expenses related to your project. So if you truly don't have $10,000 worth of expenses that year, and you only disperse $5,000 of it from Fractured Atlas for the costs that you do have to pay, then you'll only be required to report $5,000 worth of income on that grant. So it's ultimately, if you have a choice, it's up to you which you want to pursue, but there is some potential tax implications for you to take into account that might be worth the 7% that we charge when we process it. Question about the eligibility requirement: can it be met from things like ticket sales, excuse me, or must it be from donors? So we are looking for $1,000 in contributed revenue. It's great that you have earned revenue, that likely that'll give you some points with the funder, but they are also looking to see that people in your community or other interested parties are willing to open up their wallets and make charitable or charitable contributions out of the kindness of their heart because they want to support the work that you're doing and not just pay you something to get a product in exchange. So we would be looking to see that it's in contributed revenue, which could be other kinds of grants. If you did get one of those grants that can be made payable to an individual directly, or if you've run a Kickstarter campaign in the past or another crowdfunding campaign that you can send us a link to, we'll be happy to look at your previous fundraising and waive that requirement so that you can apply for grants sooner rather than later. Does Fractured Atlas provide fiscal sponsorship or only act as a liaison? Not quite sure that I understand that question, because we do both. So the fiscal sponsorship is what would make you eligible for the grant, and we would act as a liaison, and likely we need to have some conversations with the foundation, ensure that contractual requirements are being met. But if you have any clarity to provide on that question, I'll be happy to discuss that further. Another good question about the eligibility requirement: can the $1,000 come from yourself? So that's a little bit cheating. Also, I would say that if the $1,000 comes from your spouse or your mom or someone that is close to you, that's a little bit cheating. If it comes from you, we likely wouldn't be able to waive the requirement. I would say that you probably shouldn't make a charitable donation to Fractured Atlas in support of your work. It's unlikely that you'd be able to write that off on your taxes because it could raise some red flags for you to be reporting income from Fractured Atlas and at the same time a charitable tax-deductible donation to Fractured Atlas. And if you have money that you're willing to part with to put towards project-related expenses, you should just do that and avoid our 7% fee. So it's a little complicated, but in general, a $1,000 donation from yourself would not be used to waive the requirement. Another question: is it possible or appropriate to apply for grants to fund specific production goalposts? For instance, during development or pre-production, requesting funding to travel to another country to do research, recording before the production itself begins. It is totally possible, totally appropriate to do that. I don't know if the person asking this question is in New York State, but there is a funding opportunity with New York State Council for the Arts. They fund artists of all disciplines in the state of New York, and for filmmakers, they have pre-production grants, production grants, post-production grants, and that would certainly be true of other foundations as well. That's a great question. And you'd obviously want to be clear about that in your proposal to say, our total film is going to cost $100,000. We're going to spend $15,000 of that on pre-production to do research or scout locations in another country, so we're asking for $5,000 in support of that goal. That's totally appropriate. Even for pre-production, though, they'd likely be looking to see that you have other income, other contributions, other people who've said, hey, I like this work and want to make a donation as well. Great questions, everyone. This is a bit of a higher level webinar, and obviously not just an orientation to fiscal sponsorship, but if you're applying for a grant, you're a little bit further down the road than someone just fresh out of the gate. So I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen to my voice and hear me share some of my expertise on grants and grant making. Oh, another question. So I need to be a business first before applying for fiscal sponsorship and collect $1,000 for free events open to the public that I pay for myself. Well, you don't need to establish a formal business entity, but you do just have to have $1,000 in donations before you can apply for grants. So you don't need to have that $1,000 in order to be fiscally sponsored. You're welcome to sign up for fiscal sponsorship having raised no money previously. It's just before you can send in a proposal to a foundation that includes our 501c3 status, we would require that you raise $1,000 from individual donors first. And we have a crowdfunding platform called Fundraising by Fraction Atlas that you'd be welcome to use to run a campaign. Maybe you want to raise $1,000 using that platform. Maybe you want to try and raise more than that. In fact, it probably would be a good idea to set a little bit of a higher goal, set your sights a little higher with a crowdfunding campaign. But you do not need to have raised any money or formed any kind of formal business entity in order to be eligible for fiscal sponsorship. We offer a webinar that's called Intro to Fiscal Sponsorship, which you can find a recording of in our knowledge base that talks a lot about the application process and onboarding, as well as what the eligibility requirements are in order to be fiscally sponsored. But again, thank you so much for calling into this webinar. I'm going to send you all a link to a recording by the end of this week. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch at support@fracturedatlas.org. Our team of program associates generally know at least as much as I do, if not more, and so they'll be happy to answer whatever questions you have about any particular grant applications that you're looking at or about a strategy for grant making broadly. Hope you all have yummy dinners waiting for you. I hope I do as well, and have a good night. I hope we talk soon. Okay, bye-bye.